Take it away, guys.
All right, then we get started. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Whether that be here in person or virtually via Zoom. My name is Carolyn Rivera and this is Rafael Montan. You're both members of the Cornell chapter to the Committee on U.S.-Latin American Relations, an organization under the Center for Transformative Action that has been around since the 60s. CUSLAR meets Thursdays in Bell Taylor Hall, 316 at 5 p.m. So if you guys are interested in what we do, we would really love to have you.
So today's event is titled El Salvador State of Exception, Martial Law and Resistance under Bukele. And we will delve into a discussion of the recent Salvadoran elections, which were in February, and the ways in which civil society has responded to the authoritarianism of President Bukele's administration. Nayib Bukele has been president of El Salvador since 2019 and has become one of the strongmen of Latin American politics, like Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil and Javier Milei of Argentina. Most notably, he has vowed to take down gang violence through extraordinarily draconian measures, incarcerating over 100,000 people. As I said, on February 4th of this year, elections were held in El Salvador and abroad that had various reports of fraud and different irregularities, and our event will focus on these reports and a resistance to Bukele.
So today we are joined by a panel of speakers from CUSPES, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. Yesenia Portillo serves as the Program Director for CUSPES. She's joining us via Zoom. And Isaiah Gutman is a member of the delegation that went to El Salvador to observe the elections. We are also joined by the Richard J. Swartz Professor of Government and pro-faculty member of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, Professor Kenneth Roberts. Thank you all for coming.
And a few final thank yous before we get started. Thank you to CUSLAR Program Director Jorge Defendini in the back over there for helping coordinate the event, order food, help reserve space. Thank you to the CUSLAR Board of Directors that also are supporting the event, and the many organizations that help publicize the event on campus. A special thanks to CUSPES for collaborating with us on this event, and to our panelists as well, and to you all for listening and engaging. So let's get started.
So my first question, what were your observations of the election?
Yeah, I can start off with a couple of thoughts. So, hey everyone, I'm Isaiah. I'm a local activist, and my sort of background in this is that I was a student of the history of El Salvador before I went on this delegation. And so I think it's important to start out with a couple words on the context of this election before we get to what we were able to witness on the ground on election day and in the aftermath of Bukele's unconstitutional re-election. Okay, so I want to just first start by asking everyone in the audience here what you know about Nayib Bukele, what you've heard about him before today. Does anyone want to volunteer to share some thoughts? Yeah.
I know that he like began using like martial laws, and like it was introduced before like harsh crackdowns on gangs by like just mass incarceration and like discriminate arresting people. Yeah.
Is that along the same lines as what you've heard?
Yeah, I was gonna say that I've heard that he's been very in favor of incorporating cryptocurrency into the national movement, which, you know.
I know that at least a few people I've talked to in Colombia and Ecuador really like his policies in comparison to the politics that they're doing in their own countries right now. So this seems like, at least in some circles, to be a pretty popular figure.
Yeah, so I think that covers sort of the three main points that we hear in the media in the US about Bukele and his rise to power. One, that the state of exception the crackdown on gangs is a major policy. Two, that he loves cryptocurrency, and this is like one of the ways he made himself a popular figure, not just in El Salvador, but all over the world, on Twitter, online, right? And that he's very popular. Now, none of these things are incorrect, but there's a lot more context to understand that I didn't fully understand until I went to the country. So one thing that we don't hear about at all when we hear about El Salvador, the elections, developments in that country, is that Nayib Bukele, his entire project has been an attack on the left wing, specifically the FMLN in El Salvador. And that this has structured both his campaign in 2019 and a lot of the policies he's undertaken after that. And that's not to say that these other policies are fake or not relevant, but this is a part of his popularity and his rise to power that isn't covered. And so when he ran for president in 2019, he made a big part of his campaign about denouncing both existing dominant parties, the FMLN and Arena, as corrupt and not serving the will of the people. He essentially painted them with the same brush, saying the left and the right are the same, they're working together, and they're both corrupt. We need something new. Once he got into power, though, he didn't treat Arena and the FMLN as though they were the same. Since Bukele's administration took power in 2019, they've made a point to systematically arrest leaders of the FMLN and put them in prison, at times for over 2 years without a trial, indefinite detention. Many have gone into exile. Many have been forced to leave their posts, resign from politics entirely because of these attacks. And this is even before the state of exception that has become famous for cracking down on gang violence. One of his first policies in his administration was to fire over 20,000 public workers in a variety of sectors, but mainly the health sectors and in other service sectors. He shuttered 34 of 39 social programs that the FMLN had implemented during their time in the executive from 2009 to 2019. And many of those programs were specifically designed to help women and the LGBT community in El Salvador. So he has adopted a lot of the right-wing what some in US might call diversity, equity, and inclusion, that type of women, anti-minority politics that we've seen in our own country and throughout Latin America. He's also used the state of exception in a politicized way. So you might have heard there's a huge drop in gang violence. That's true. There's also over 80,000 people in prison without a charge against them, right? So that doesn't mean that they're thrown in jail because they committed gang violence. They're suspected of potentially being gang members. And even by the government's own admission, almost 8,000 of those initial people who were imprisoned were innocent and were released after months of detention without a trial. And it's generally believed by civil society groups in El Salvador that up to a third or more of those currently detained under the state of exception are not gang members. So as you might imagine, this has created a culture of fear among people, especially people in areas that have traditionally been allied with the FMLN and the left. And so this means that in the country, there's a significant fear, there's a significant idea that Bukele is someone who is celebrated for this gang violence, but at the same time, people don't feel comfortable speaking out. So that's a couple things that we heard. Everything that I've just said, I didn't look this up online. We heard this from groups who have been organizing against these abuses in El Salvador. We heard this directly from Salvadorans, leaders of social movement organizations, regular people, teachers, nurses, public workers who have been fired. We heard from them directly on this delegation about these developments. So that's just a couple items that we learned to set the stage for the election. And then I think Yesenia was going to share some information on the election itself and what we saw there.
Yeah, thank you, Isaiah. Can people see me or just the slides?
Just the slides you're saying.
Okay, that's fine. Well, hi everyone. My name is Yesenia. Maybe once we go through the slides, I can turn it off and say hello, so people can see me. But yeah, thank you everybody for having us. And thank you, Isaiah, for those comments. Well, in the last slide, there's some photos of some of the folks we met with, including the committee of family members, of political prisoners in El Salvador. And according to them, they've identified over 150 political prisoners, ranging from former FMLN officials to union leaders, environmentalists, as Isaiah mentioned. And so, that's the context that we're going into with regards to the election. And actually, I think before jumping into that, I also just want to share briefly as possible, a little bit about the history of El Salvador. So previous, in the 1980 to 1992, there was a US sponsored civil war, wherein which, people took up arms after decades of military dictatorships. So from 1932, so the early 1900s, up until the Civil War started, there was just a series of military dictatorship after military dictatorship. So the 1992 peace accords that were signed allowed for people that are organizing to be able to organize without fear of disappearance and assassination by the state, which was happening in an extreme form prior to that. And there was no representation and no meaningful, significant representation of leftist social movement organizations within politics. So there was there's no left political party. It was just elite, aligned parties that were able to run for office, mostly in sham elections. So the 1992 peace accords really set the stage for fair, getting to more fair and free elections in El Salvador. And so, this is the first time since the signing of the peace accords that elections are happening in conditions of basically martial law. So, it's a question there. Can fair and free elections happen when there's been a 2-year nationwide suspension of constitutional rights? And I don't think I need to go too much more into this because I think Isaiah went pretty well into it. Sorry. And here's some kind of photos of land offenders being arrested under the state of exception, union leaders being arrested under the state of exception. The photo in the middle is of a protest, protest sign. It says dictatorial police. And then it says, you're going to jail for criticizing the government. So kind of just to show that this is a sentiment in the streets too. And one of the groups that we also met with that was in the original photo is of the movement of victims of the regime. So that's also been a big group that has mobilized in the streets that are of family members who have been impacted by the state of exception, family members of people who are currently imprisoned. So that's one of the things. Another issue is that Bukele's reelection was unconstitutional to begin with. And the reason why it's unconstitutional is because of the history that I shared about, right? So there is a long history of authoritarian governments in El Salvador. So the Salvadoran Constitution explicitly prohibits consecutive reelection in El Salvador's at least 6 times. And the reason why Bukele, the excuse that was used in order for Bukele to run for office is that the reason he was able to get away with it, I'm sorry, is because he already controlled the judiciary. So in May of 2021, there was pretty much a judicial coup where Bukele's political party that has a supermajority already in the Legislative Assembly illegally replaced and removed all 5 Supreme Court justices, or the justices of the Constitutional Chamber. So here, you know, the body that would intervene in this instance when there's an unconstitutional and illegal candidate is already co-opted by the regime. In addition, the Supreme Electoral Tribunal, which is supposed to be an independent body that was established under the peace accords in order to help ensure fair and free elections, approved his candidacy. You know, so that was already also an indication of a Supreme Electoral Tribunal that is also co-opted. It can't be trusted if it's permitting a candidacy that's clearly unconstitutional. So that's one of the issues. Major issue. Second major issue. Additionally, in the months, the year and months within the year of the election, there were drastic changes made to the electoral political system of El Salvador. So the legislative seats were reduced from 84 to 60. And the vote in the exterior was done in such a way that it would also benefit increased representation of Bukele's party called Nuevas Ideas, or New Ideas, in the Legislative Assembly, because all of the votes from the exterior were going to be counted to San Salvador, which is the largest department and holds the largest number of seats in the Legislative Assembly. So that's one example. But also the way that legislative seats and representation in the legislature is counted was also changed. And these changes were all done in order to specifically to benefit Bukele's party. And as well as gerrymandering that happened. So the municipalities were reduced from 246 to 44. So no longer would there be you know, local level representation elected by the people of 246 mayors. Now it's all consolidated into 44. And one of the things that we learned about is how this dilutes the individual's vote. So no longer are they electing a representative that has a more direct impact, but their vote is diluted into a much larger geographic area. So yeah, I don't know, Isaiah, if you wanted to share a little bit also about what we saw more specifically, like on the around elections, on election day, and then I can share a little bit more about the results after.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. So just in the days leading up to the election, what is most striking in my memory is seeing large numbers of armed military personnel on the streets of San Salvador. So our delegation was stationed in a neighborhood in the middle of the city. San Salvador is the capital, it's the largest city in the country. And about 3 or 4 days before the election, we started seeing groups of 5 to 10, up to 15 or 20 armed military personnel on the streets. We even saw them stop random men on sidewalks, put them up against the wall, strip search them, and in some cases detain them. And this was something that was ubiquitous throughout the city. We would drive around in a bus and we would see military in front of us on the streets, in the backs of trucks. We saw military walking down the streets. And this wasn't, although El Salvador is under the state of exception, this wasn't something we saw every day on the delegation. This was specifically a pre-election demonstration, right? This idea that Bukele was showing his strength as a leader. I can protect you with these military, with the military, but also a threat. I have the control of the military. I have the military is on my side. This is how justice is implemented in El Salvador. But what was most interesting was that after those days, a couple days before the election. In the day before the election, the streets were completely empty of all military. So Bukele's government was able to effectively show, we can protect you, or we can put military out there when we want, and we can also take that protection away. So that was something that absolutely was on people's minds as we approached the election. On election day itself, I was able to observe at 3 separate election day sites, although I mostly observed at one site. And at that site, we saw an absolute mess that was caused by some of these policies that Yesenia outlined, where not only was the allocation of seats and the method of allotment changed before the election, there were also changes to how the election was administered. And this resulted in a huge mess where there were individual kits of computers, scanners, printers, projectors, and Wi-Fi modems that weren't just assigned to every election site, they were assigned to every election table in every election site. There are over 10,000 sites, and at each site there were 15 to 30 tables. And so that meant that at a lot of these sites, there was no Wi-Fi existing already. There weren't even outlets. So at my site, these kits were delivered and they weren't able to set them up for hours and hours after they were delivered. They had to bring in these long extension cables that were strung up just to plug in lights so that the kits could be opened and seen, because it was getting dark and there weren't lights already there. So that meant just at that site that of the 24 tables at this voting site, 1 submitted their results accurately on the day of the election. And this was not an isolated issue. We saw that after the first day of the election, about 70% of the total results in the presidential election were reported, but less than 5% of the legislative results were reported on that same day. There were also changes that were made in terms of the order of counting votes, in terms of presidential and legislative votes. It's a lot of in the weeds details, but the overall result was to make it so that this process was ridiculously drawn out and basically just begging for interference and irregularities to happen. At the site that I observed, there were election officials who were there from 3 a.m. on the day of the election, and they stayed there counting votes past 3 a.m. the next morning. They didn't get to go home and sleep. In a lot of cases, there weren't alternates or substitutes, so it was the same people there for 24 hours straight, administering the election, counting votes. And keep in mind that El Salvador is a very hot climate. So even though this was the winter, it was 85 degrees on election day. And most of election day, you know, there were tents in some cases, but a lot of people are directly in the sunlight. It was exhausting for us as observers. I can't imagine how it was for the people running the election itself.
Yeah,
Yes,
and
you talk about the results.
yeah, well, I was gonna just also add a couple of things here, which is that basically what happened on election day was not what we expected at all. So, you know, we've observed, CSPS as an organization has observed pretty much every single election since the signing of the peace accords, except for the one that happened during COVID. We didn't observe that in person. And this was you know, we had people in our delegation who had observed multiple elections, including myself, and we've seen the Salvadoran government be able to carry out. So this was the second election under this administration that they held a legislative election. So we didn't go to the first one that they carried out, but every single election that CSPS has observed prior to this has run fairly smoothly. A lot of the times the interventions that happen, interference that happens, even sometimes by the US government, by the right wing that we have been denouncing, usually come, you know, in the lead up to the election, and they have impacts. But a lot of, you know, the voting itself gets carried out in a very clear and transparent way. You know, the ballots are counted by hand, every single one, and then tallied, and then submitted electronically. And this has never been an issue. And we're talking about a government that boasts being, you know, so high tech and supposedly bringing El Salvador into the first world and like so highly developed. On the other side of that is high levels of corruption. And this is the most amount of money that El Salvador has ever spent on an election. And so the fact that there was widespread mass technological failure on the day of the election is highly unexpected and really should not have happened. And there is a large reason to believe that a lot of it happened intentionally. The chaos that was created was intentional. So then there had to be a ballot by ballot recount, which has never happened since the signing of the peace accords that happened after election day. And that process was carried out for almost 3 weeks when there was a second municipal election that the Supreme Electoral Tribunal needed to have been preparing the population for. And in that meantime, yes, like there were ballot boxes that went missing for extended periods of time. So there's a lot of concern that the results that were, that the official end results are not actually reflective of reality. And there's not really a way to, there's not a lot of trust in the final results. What is unquestioned is that Nayib Bukele won in a landslide, despite his candidacy being unconstitutional. In this authoritarian government, what they need to maintain is full power without a shadow of a doubt of all branches of government, and that requires full control of the Legislative Assembly and of the municipal elections. And the issue is that support for his politicians had been waning, and that's reflected in the polls, and it's reflected in the election results. As untrustworthy as they are, his legislators received about 1 million votes lower than he did. But because of, and then I'm moving into a little bit of the results, because of the reforms that were made, his legislators maintained almost full control over the Legislative Assembly. There are only about 3 opposition candidates that maintain seats in the Legislative Assembly. And the way that it looks for the FMLN, which is the country's only leftist party, they have 0 seats in the Legislative Assembly. But if you compare the number of votes that they received to, you know, if we use the number of votes that they received to the way that the seats should have been distributed prior to the reforms, they would have had 6 legislative seats instead of 0. In this current term, they have 4. So they actually would have gained a couple of seats in the Legislative Assembly. And now there's no representation at all from the country's only leftist party, which means that El Salvador currently is fully right-wing in the Legislative Assembly, with the exception, no, there is no exception, it's fully right-wing. There are 3 opposition seats, but they are opposition, they're held by right-wing opposition parties, which are Arena and Nuestro Tiempo. So that's the Legislative Assembly. With regards to the municipal elections, I mentioned the gerrymandering, but these images, if folks can see them, it shows how, you know, the places that you see in red or mostly red, because the orange and the green are also they're not Nuevas Ideas, which is Bukele's party, but there are 2 parties that are aligned with him. And so then you'll see that the kind of, when it pulls out, that's the new districts or the new municipalities that were created. So the smaller breakdowns include the old municipalities, and that's where you see more diversity of representation. So the red is the FMLN, which is the country's leftist party. And if you see, this is based off this year's numbers, but it shows the previous map. So the FMLN would have ended up with 21 mayors, but because of the gerrymandering, they ended up with 0. I think I don't know if we should pause for questions because we've been talking a lot.
I think, yeah, we could do that. But thank you for providing the context and these like preliminary observations of the event. Well, you have, we got that slide up, of the, what's going on the abroad. So how
Sorry.
did people vote abroad here in the States, for instance? Were there like protests? Like, I feel like on social media we hear so much about people supporting Bukele, and people are like, oh, like some people just love him here in the US. And they see him like Trump or like someone else like that. So how is like the support for Bukele in the States?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. So there are about 1.5 million, I think, Salvadorans living in the United States or abroad. And so it's not the first time that Salvadorans can vote in the exterior. But this time the vote in the exterior was expanded. Like the ability for people to vote in the exterior was highly expanded, and the eligibility requirements were dramatically loosened. And so this was one of the concerns, the fact that people could vote with expired identification documents or with Salvadoran passports, and that the passport database is really riddled with inconsistencies. And so there was not a good way for that to be, there was no voter registry created also for voting abroad. And let's see what else. The issues with the system, the electronic voting system. So in the past, when electronic voting has been permitted, there was a registry, and people could vote after registering via mail, and also at locations in person. Now people were allowed to vote online from their phone for several weeks beforehand, and there were concerns about the biometric facial verification that was being used for online voting also had widespread failures. The Supreme Electoral Tribunal denied requests for third-party access to verify the election results. So those were some of the kind of many issues related to voting abroad and voting in the exterior. Despite, one could believe that people voting abroad should be readily accessible, it should also be verifiable and trusted, right? And so there are a lot of reasons and ways in which that wasn't the case here. And the other issues, the way that I think I mentioned this earlier, that just in the past, there was no voting for the Legislative Assembly, just for presidency. And the way they chose to do it in this election is that the votes for the Legislative Assembly all went to, or the most of them went to San Salvador. So it had a higher impact and disproportionate impact, really, in the Legislative Assembly. There were about 300,000 Salvadorans that voted abroad, and there were, again, many issues. There was overcrowding at the voting centers, and ultimately Bukele won 98.6% of the online vote from abroad and 95.5% of the in-person electronic votes.
Wow.
As far as protests, again, with a lot of concerns about how verifiable that is, right?
Yeah.
As far as protests, there are, these are just some examples of different protests that have happened in DC, in San Francisco. I couldn't find one from LA, but there's definitely been protests in LA as well, with regards to the state of exception, the persecution of water defenders, and the unconstitutional re-election are most of what the protests have centered around. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So how can we look at this from a comparative politics perspective? And where else have we seen this authoritarianism?
Yes, for you, Professor.
Okay, well, thanks. It's great to see you all looking at what's happening in El Salvador and trying to understand what's taking place, because it is quite discouraging to see the erosion of the democratic gains that had been made in the country since the 1992 peace accords, even recognizing that there were certain flaws in the democratic regime and there were limitations, but compared to where the country was, it was, in the 1970s and 1980s is the severe military repression in the 1970s and then the civil war in the 1980s. El Salvador really made significant progress towards constructing at least basic democratic norms and procedures after the 1992 peace accords, and that was in some ways part of a larger process within Latin America. Most of Latin America moved away from the military dictatorships of the recent past in the 1980s, and there was significant democratic progress, even if the regimes continued to have a number of flaws. And in many ways, Latin America was seen as a successful example of what came to be known globally as the third wave of democratization, because there were over 60 to 70 different countries that made a transition from authoritarianism to something that was at least mostly democratic in the 1980s and 1990s. But Latin America was seen as a real success case for this. And what's really started to worry people over the last 10 years, and this is part of a global process, but it's begun to take hold in Latin America as well, which is basically what we call democratic erosion or democratic backsliding. So you've probably heard some of the debates about democratic backsliding, and prominent cases of this in Hungary and Turkey. There's a version of it in India. We talk about Venezuela, Nicaragua, and ultimately, for a while it was thought that Latin America was not really part of this process of democratic erosion or backsliding, but increasingly we see that it is. I mean, the Bolsonaro regime in Brazil, although in the end the courts sort of maintained their independence in Brazil, and Bolsonaro never had a majority in the legislature like Bukele ends up with, which allows him to then capture the courts and to take over the electoral institutions. So Bolsonaro didn't get away with some things, and in the end he was defeated by Lula in the election last year. But it's interesting because many people, there was a process of significant democratic erosion underway in Guatemala, but Guatemala more recently is quite a success case where a popular democratic movement was able to win in the elections, and even though the incumbent rulers did everything they could to try to block a democratic transition to a transition to the opposition coming to power in Guatemala. But in the end, they were able to take power. And so Guatemala has seen real democratic progress, which is interesting because they also came out of the Civil War in the 1990s. And in many ways, Guatemala was seen as a much less successful case of democratization at the turn of the century compared to El Salvador, in part because the revolutionary movement in Guatemala didn't have the same strength that the FMLN had. And so the FMLN was able to make a transition from being a revolutionary movement to becoming a political party, competing in the democratic arena, then eventually was able to win national elections in El Salvador. And that was never the case for the revolutionary left in Guatemala. So in some ways, the recent success of Guatemala was a big surprise to people, but the erosion in El Salvador under Bukele is a real concern. And it's a good example of this larger process of democratic erosion or backsliding, which is quite different from the historical pattern in Latin America, because there's a long tradition of military coups in Latin America. I mean, in the old days, democracies broke down because the military bombs the presidential palace in Santiago, and El Salvador's had a number of military coups in the past. And so in the old the old model of democratic breakdowns was the military intervening and taking over, oftentimes then with very severe repression following. What's especially pernicious about this democratic backsliding is it takes place within democratic institutions themselves. So it's not an external actor like the military intervening, but it's an elected incumbent democratic leader like Bukele, who was elected president in 2019, operating within democratic institutions, but then using those institutions to concentrate power in his own hands and to neutralize any democratic checks and balances through the courts, the legislature, the independence of the electoral institutions that have to oversee the integrity of the process. And you all did a great job of helping us understand the myriad ways in which a country that did have, pretty, relatively clean, efficient elections that were reliable and votes were accurately counted, and it was not, a very messy affair before you get to the recent round of elections. But now you see the election process itself, the integrity of the process has been severely compromised. And in part, that's because Bukele controls the electoral institutions in the country. He's neutralized, he's taken over the courts. He had a supermajority in the legislature, now manipulating the electoral institutions in ways that allow him to capture an even larger majority within the legislature. So this is all part of this logic of what we call democratic backsliding, operating within democratic institutions to undermine democracy itself. And it's a very, very troubling prospect. And what's especially troublesome about the Salvadoran case, Bukele, I think Hannah mentioned this before, Bukele is becoming a folk hero for the right elsewhere in Latin America because of cracking down on crime and insecurity. I should point out El Salvador under Bukele has now overtaken the United States as the country with the highest rate of incarceration in the world. That rather dubious distinction belonged to the United States until Bukele. So it's 1.7% of the Salvadoran population is behind bars. Most of them, without having charges brought against them, they're going to move towards mass trials. But basically, these are people who have, they literally, the military encircles entire towns and communities, and they arrest a large number of young men. You would not want to be a young man with a tattoo in El Salvador when the military does these roundups. They're basically taking people off the streets, whether there is any evidence of them having, done anything wrong or being in a gang or anything else. So they've imprisoned as part of the state of emergency that was declared 2 years ago, and every month Bukele renews the state of emergency. So it's been renewed now, I think 24 times over the last 2 years. And it basically allows the military, using the military as a force, to go into communities and arrest anyone of any sort of suspicion. Some 80,000 people have been arrested as part of this state of emergency. And El Salvador has the highest rate of imprisonment in the world. And it's very troubling when I haven't been to El Salvador actually since Bukele was elected, but I've been in Ecuador in recent times, in Chile, and it's very frightening to hear Ecuadorians and Chileans talking about, we need our Bukele. And that's what you're hearing in other places. And it's in part, it's indicative of how incredibly threatening to people the crime and insecurity is. Latin America is the world's most dangerous region. The rate of violent crime is higher in Latin America than any other place in the world that is not in a war. And it is severely affecting democratic politics in Latin America. And El Salvador, you see this most dramatically. Even clearly Bukele manipulated the electoral process in all the ways you all talked about, but as you said, he did have he had a very high vote. He is popular in El Salvador. And he is seen, and there has been a very sharp decline in the rate of criminal violence in El Salvador under Bukele. But the trouble is he has done that by moving away from all of these democratic gains that the country had made over the last couple of decades since 1992. One final word, if I could just point out, there's electoral fraud. There's nothing new about, messy, unclean, fraudulent elections in El Salvador. It was the norm before the peace accords In fact, the Civil War began in the late 70s in response to stolen elections, one in 1972, the other in 1977. And there were events, there were 5 different guerrilla movements that emerged, revolutionary movements that emerged in the 1970s, that eventually merged into the FMLN, formed the FMLN. But they all took up arms, the first couple after the 1972 election fraud, and then the others after the 1977 election fraud. So there is a history of that that's very disturbing to see any sort of return to this kind of manipulation of the democratic institutions.
If I could just add something very briefly to what you said, Professor Roberts, that was an excellent explanation of everything that's going on and covered a lot of what we saw as well. You talked about how Bukele has inspired these right-wing movements across Latin America. There's also a lot of interplay between his movement and Trump's movement in the US. And one piece of evidence for that is that Bukele was a featured guest at the latest CPAC, Conservative Political Action Conference, right? And he used his platform to talk about globalists and wokeness and a lot of the other ideas that Trump's Republican Party has been pushing. And it's absolutely no accident that Bukele echoes a lot of Trump's talking points, and he was elected while Trump was in power, positioned himself as an ally of Trump, and that he would bring El Salvador closer to the US, which at the time meant Trump. And interestingly, Bukele has used some anti-American rhetoric to his advantage, you know, saying that the FMLN is tied to the CIA, for example. But he, which is totally.
If you know the historical record, it's hard to get out that.
But he does want to be seen as in alliance with these right-wing parties in Latin America, but especially Trump in the US, and has modeled his public persona off of Trump's personality and especially his use of social media and propaganda to maintain his popularity.
I also wanted to add a few thoughts with regards to this idea of security and the idea that Bukele has made El Salvador safer. So one of the major things that I want to make sure to highlight is that his policies are not new. Obviously, punitive policing and mass incarceration are not new. And these kinds of policies that are very punitive, they call them mano dura when they first were implemented in El Salvador to address the gang situation in the 1990s, early 2000s, when the right wing was still in the executive. And these are policies that have always been highly promoted by the United States through their influence with the US Embassy, USAID, et cetera. And there was a lot of interventionism happening to make sure that that those are the policies that were happening. So El Salvador already had, I think, the second highest incarceration rate in the world. And the US has spent hundreds of millions of dollars since, the early 2000s to address the issue of crime and violence and gang violence in El Salvador. And when there has been eras of, punitive policing, the issue's never truly resolved. And it's only ever really come back in larger force. And so that's one thing. Another thing is that there is a cover-up of the crime and the violence, the homicide rates that are happening in El Salvador. There's a really astronomical increase in disappearances. So the bodies are being found in clandestine graves. And when Bukele came to office, there was a change in policy where those bodies that were being found in clandestine graves were not going to be included in the daily homicide rates, for example. Another thing that dropped the daily homicide rates that the government is reporting is that anybody that was killed in a confrontation with the police was also not going to be included in the daily homicide rate. And so while Bukele and his propaganda claims that, they've gotten rid of all the homicides and El Salvador is now the safest country in the Western Hemisphere or in Latin America, they are not talking about the increase in clandestine graves. Under his administration, they found the largest clandestine grave in all of Latin America. And it's not the only one. And there's a podcast about it if y'all want to find it on Spotify. It's called Humo, Humo. So I just want to also name that that there it is important to also question the validity of this security that supposedly exists, because there are mass disappearances that are happening. And then also, so while the government kind of covers up these disappearances and these crimes that are still happening in El Salvador, they overinflate crimes that are happening, so they're selective about when they talk about homicides. So if there's a homicide that happens in a historically organized community, for example, in the community of Cabañas that led in the struggle against mining, and Chalatenango, both of them, they experience military sieges. And the government says, we're going to send thousands upon thousands upon thousands of soldiers into your community, arrest dozens of youth arbitrarily, because there's gang structures there, even though the community says, actually, no, there's never been gang structures here. And really, this is an intent to stop organizing in our communities, make us be afraid of organizing against you. So I encourage folks to look up the Santa Marta case, the case of the anti-mining activists in Santa Marta that were arrested. And those areas where people voted against him, but don't have their representation because of the gerrymandering. They in the last couple weeks ago, they experienced 6,000 soldiers and police in their communities going door to door looking for youth, and they arrested 50 people. And the community says there is no crime there. So they're selective. They say this is where the crime is happening while covering up the disappearances that keep coming up. So I don't know if there's more questions. I also wanted to share a little bit more about the role of the United States. I mentioned it a little bit with regards to, there's not a lot of concern really coming from the U.S. State Department or the U.S. Embassy. And, we did meet with the U.S. Embassy with the delegates when we were in El Salvador. So I don't know, Isaiah, if you wanted to share a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah, I mean, that was the weirdest, trippiest experience on the whole delegation, was that we got access to meet with officials from the US Embassy. Now, the Salvadoran embassy is not your average embassy. It's basically a fortified compound that is the second largest US embassy in the world. They have their own golf course in this embassy, okay? So we got access to this embassy. Probably about 8 of us were able to meet with 2 officials from the embassy. It turned out one of them went to Cornell, which we discovered. He didn't say a single word after we found out he was from Cornell. So, but what we presented all of these observations that we found on the delegation, talked about the context, all of these, all of the changes in the law leading up to the election, a lot of these unconstitutional actions by Bukele. The US Embassy essentially said, yeah, we're aware of that, but our strategy is that it's not effective to call out what Bukele has done wrong. And instead, we're using the strategy, might remind you of Biden's strategy with Netanyahu in Israel right now, of this sort of bear hug strategy. We will compliment Bukele, we're gonna work with him, we're gonna try to make him a friend, and then he'll listen to us if we make him a friend. Needless to say, that hasn't really borne any results that we've seen, right? We were told when we were there, and this is not like a fact to share, but the embassy officials were like, yeah, Bukele promised us that he'll wind down the state of exception after the election. As far as I know, that hasn't happened yet. And so the sense that we got from that meeting was that the US Embassy is essentially complicit in what Bukele is doing, because they're fully aware of how illegal, of how these actions constitute democratic backsliding. They may have even used that term. I don't know if any of you remember, but they were essentially, we completely agree with your analysis, and we want to work with Bukele to sort of correct these mistakes, right? Which, from our vantage point, we haven't seen that happen at the very least.
Yeah, let me see. I think I have a couple slides on it. Well, and also just to close out my thought, I think I forgot to say this, the fact about his popularity also, sorry to go back and forth. But I have some images here of the popular social movement protests. They've been quite massive, and they were especially so right before the state of exception. But, how do we measure the popularity of a regime that has the whole entire country without any constitutional rights? So people are very afraid to say what they actually think about this government. And people are facing that and taking to the streets regardless of the fear, and having to really organize past fear in this really counter-revolutionary period that El Salvador is living. But with regards to the US Embassy, moving back to that, I have a couple of examples here of how the US has been complicit. So, and we could go far back to the entirety of his administration, even when they were questioning the things that were happening. So, when all 5 Supreme Court magistrates were illegally removed and replaced, there were statements coming even from Kamala Harris, raising concern about this democratic backsliding. At the same time, they continued to send military helicopters, like basically on the same day, so you'd see the US ambassador at the time, Jean Maines, raising concern, but then also the very next tweet being like, and here's these military helicopters that we're donating. So that very limited kind of denouncements or raising concerns basically have completely flipped to silence. Ever since the state of exception, there's been almost nothing coming from the Biden administration. And in the lead up to Bukele's unconstitutional candidacy being registered, we had the State Department going to visit him as Bukele had encircled the perimeter of the Supreme Electoral Tribunal in anticipation of his unconstitutional reelection candidacy. So basically, and we have statements from US officials basically saying it's up for the Salvadoran people to decide who they want to be president, without naming all of these things that we just named, the state of exception, the abuse of human rights, the fact that it's unconstitutional, the authoritarian regime, etc. So they act like they're not interfering, but really they are, because they're meeting with him in the days before and after his candidacy is registered, talking about how good their relationship is and how they're looking forward to continuing to cooperate with him. So that's a lot of the work that CISPAS has been doing, as well as like raising awareness and pushing back against the silence that's happening from our government, from the US government. Speaking with legislators here in the US, like Representative Ilhan Omar put out a letter with a lot of other colleagues raising concerns. And so here Bukele said, we're honored to receive your attacks just days before our election. I would be very worried if we had your support. As if the Biden administration hasn't been co-signing, his presidency and his unconstitutional reelection. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Going back to this slide, I think this is a statement from the popular social movement following the municipal elections of March 3rd, which, by the way, had the lowest turnout in history. So the elections happened on 2 days. In February, which is the one we went to observe, was the presidential and legislative election. And then the March 3rd election was the municipal election. And that's also something that they maneuvered. because they knew that there was less support for their mayors. So they put that election second. And because it was supposed to be legislative and municipal and then presidential. And basically that was the March 3rd election. Was one of the things that characterized it was of extremely low turnout. So in some places it was as low as 20% turnout, where average is always around 50. And the average of in the whole country was 30%, which is extremely low. There hasn't been such a low turnout for a Salvadoran election since the signing of the peace accords. And here the folks from the Popular Social Movement says that Bukele's unconstitutional reelection is the highest expression of a structural fraud. So everything kind of stems from that. Also concerns about the entire state being controlled by the right wing under the hegemony of Bukele's corporate interests. And that the concentration of power does not favor political stability, actually. So that's another concern for them moving forward. This concentration of power does not benefit the masses, and it's going to lead to economic instability and insecurity. They're also not more safe, as I mentioned earlier, because they're being unlawfully arrested and disappeared with no consequence and no response from the state. So the Popular Social Movement is really calling on people to strengthen their organizing in order to withstand the attacks that are coming to them, and also calling on the international community to listen to what Salvadorans are saying and listen to why people are taking to the streets and why they're organizing and what they're denouncing, not just the Salvadorans that are parroting his propaganda. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Let's open up the floor to anyone else here. We have around 15 minutes left. So, yeah, we'll start with you, Matt.
Thank you, and thank you for the explanation and to share the experience you have in the election day. Where do you get the information, the regional information from the elections previous the change of the municipality borders, and the official information of security levels by regions, and where can we access to the cases as Santa Marta, as DC told? In other words, where can we find official information so we can use it to give arguments with that kind of information, without saying that this is propaganda, that this is not real, or something like that? Where can we find that kind of information?
Well, I would say, as far as in English, CISPES, you can go to cispes.org, so CISPES.org. We write a lot of blogs that comes from that's like comes with analysis from the Popular Social Movement. And we also link, so there's a lot of references in all our blogs. So you can whatever information we're saying, you can find the links to the sources for the information. So that's one place I would say. And I can also send materials if there's a way to easily send it to attendees. Yeah. I would say, for following up about what's happening with the Santa Marta case, the water defenders, there's an organization called the Institute for Policy Studies. I'm sharing this because I know, I could share some resources, but they're usually in Spanish. But the Institute for Policy Studies is another organization that's doing a lot of accompaniment for the anti-mining activists that are being persecuted right now. Yeah, I would, in English, there's a lot of other sources that I would offer that a lot of times don't have the perspective of the Popular Social Movement necessarily. But I can share more resources.
English or Spanish? Sirve igual. Oh.
Great. Yeah, if you go to the CSPES website, you know, we have blogs on a lot of this stuff. And like I said, the resources, the references, most of them are in Spanish.
Thank you.
Maybe you guys covered this, I know I was stepping in, I'm sorry about that, but I know in the early 2000s and going into the 2010s, right, I think the term, it was coined like the pink wave, right, and throughout Latin America, seeing characters like Evo Morales, Lula da Silva, Hugo Chavez, just to name a couple, and then, right, so going into the mid-2010s, you saw a lot of almost a reaction to the pink wave, these Trump-esque figures coming to power, Bolsonaro being a great example. I forget what happened in Bolivia exactly, but I know Evo Morales moved for a couple years. How does sort of, and then I would say right now we're seeing the return almost to the pink, like back to the Lulas and the Evo Moraleses of the world. I know they're both back in power. So how does sort of what's going on in El Salvador fit into that broader Latin American context?
Sorry, yeah, it's
I think the professor kind of went over a little bit of
Okay.
that, and I'll let you share any more thoughts you have on it. But I will say one thing about this that I've heard some of our allies in the popular social movement start naming and recognizing recently, is that, I mean, and we didn't go into this very much, but you know what happened in Guatemala, it happened because the social movement was strong enough to withstand the attacks. You know, people have been organizing against the oligarchs and their corruption for so long, whereas in El Salvador we're coming from a period where the left was actually in the executive. And because Bukele was such a divisive figure, he actually came to create a lot of division. And so the Salvadoran popular social movement, for a lot of different reasons, is very weak. And the state of exception does not help, you know? And so right now, El Salvador is living a very counter-revolutionary period. And we're not sure how long this is gonna last. But it's similar to, you know, in El Salvador after Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, a dictator in 1932, he was in office for like 14 years and massacred tens of thousands of indigenous people in El Salvador, claiming that they were communists. And so we see a lot of parallels to what's happening in El Salvador right now with Nayib Bukele. You know, he's arresting tens of thousands of innocent, poor people. And one thing we didn't name is the torture and abuse and the violence that's happening in El Salvador's prisons. And there's been hundreds and hundreds of deaths in the prisons of people who have no convictions. They've never even faced a judge. People who were just taken from their homes or their workplaces. So there's some parallels with that as well. And what happened after that particular dictator in 1932 is that people were really afraid, and there was, you know, there was no for a long time. It took a long time for the popular social movement in order to be able to build up and respond. Up until, you know, the 60s, 70s, 80s, and until the start of the war. But for a couple, at least a decade, maybe a couple decades, it was a very counter-revolutionary period in El Salvador. And it's kind of what's happening right now, where a lot of the people who are, you know, there's a lot of organizing and a lot of people who have a long history of political militancy, but they were born and raised and they came up in revolutionary times, you know, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, when there was already a revolutionary wave happening. And those people, you know, the elders from the war who have long histories of organizing, they've never faced this kind of period of that's so counter-revolutionary and that's so extremely repressive.
with a accompaniment of like a weekend social movement, if that makes sense.
If I might just add briefly on, in response to your question, there was clearly a political shift to the left in Latin America, starting in the late nineties, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, then continuing in much of the region, over the, really until 2014, when the tide shifted in another direction. And what's interesting now, and then people started talking about the new right turn in the region, which I think was misguided. Essentially, what began was then simply a process of anti-incumbent voting. So where the left was in power, the economy's, the so-called commodity boom comes to an end in 2013, 2014. So and that it, in some ways propped up the progressive governments that were in power, earlier in the 2000s. But ultimately, the so-called new right turn was very short-lived. It wasn't really a new right turn. And then what's interesting is you then get the election of governments on the left in countries that had not been part of the first left turn. So Colombia, Mexico, Honduras actually elect governments of the left. And so at this point, virtually every country in Latin America, with the exception of, I guess, Panama, Dominican Republic, just a couple of countries that have not elected a left of center president over the last quarter century. And this is brand new in the region. There's a basic restructuring of democratic political orders between the left and the right in a way that is quite novel within the region. And it's manifesting itself in some ways in a new political polarization in the region, especially because there's been a revival, not just of a right, but a new far right. That Milei in Argentina, Bolsonaro, Jose Antonio Cast in Chile. So there's an outflanking on the right of sort of, the mainstream neoliberal, quite conservative political parties, but there's a new right that is explicitly authoritarian, invoking the symbolism of the military dictatorships of the 1970s in Argentina and Chile and Brazil. And this is very worrisome. And Bukele is clearly feeding into that. One of the paradoxes we should probably mention, shows you some of the anomalies of Bukele. He actually started in the FMLN. He was elected as a mayor from the FMLN, but he's very much, he has a very personal political project. He's a real opportunist. He was expelled from the FMLN because of conflicts he got into with some of the other leaders. And then he sort of and then he runs for the president against the entire political establishment, both the FMLN and Arena on the right. And then, of course, he ends up, emerging as this outsider kind of political figure, very much a political opportunist. But his project it's very personalist, but it's increasingly right-wing and increasingly authoritarian. And as you all mentioned, he has aligned himself with this new far right, Milei and Bolsonaro, Trump, and he clearly belongs to that camp. I would be careful about seeing a new left turn in the region now, in part because there's a huge backlash on the right that is taking place. And part of what's happening is that the historic parties of the center are collapsing across the region. And so you've got popular-based movements on the left in Colombia and Chile and other places. And then you've got this new right, and there's less and less in between that is organized. And it leads to a very, very polarized and, very uncertain, rather volatile scenario in terms of how that translates into democratic politics.
I think, one more question. Okay, I'll take it over.
I noticed on one of the slides, the one about the role of the US, one of the tweets mentioned that Bukele had visited Washington to discuss like a mission in Haiti. So I think that kind of points to like a US interest to have El Salvador as like a geopolitical collaborator. But I was just wondering, like what other economic or geopolitical interest does the US have to, I guess, like tolerate or even encourage the policies that Bukele is taking? Yeah.
Oh, yes, I know you're unmuted.
So thank you, Professor, for I'm learning a lot. So thank you so much for that kind of regional analysis as well. I would say that, you know, I hear this a lot, that he's shifted towards the right, and I would just want to name that his entire presidency has been a presidency that has aligned itself pretty clearly with the country's right wing, and the right wing. It's kind of like what you mentioned in terms of like a switching between the left and the executive and a return of the right. That was already underway even before Bukele. So the right wing had already gained a supermajority in the Legislative Assembly even before he came to office. And he ran for office with another right wing party, which is Ghana, which is still an allied party of him. And that party is made up of people who came from the other extreme right party, Arena. And you know, he gave his first speech at the Heritage Foundation, etc. So there's that. I think with regards to the US and its geopolitical interests, what we've seen is them using the US using the excuse of Chinese you know, influence in the region and Chinese influence in El Salvador. We even heard it from our visit at the embassy, where they said, would you rather have us training the police and military, or would you want China to do it? You remember that?
We sat in silence for about a minute.
So yeah, there's this idea that there's this there's this fear of Chinese influence, and I don't believe it to be that true. But what, you know, there is an example of something that happened recently, which is that Bukele entered into a bought $500 million worth of services from Google to digitize like government systems and institutions. This is after they completely neglected and undid everything that had been done by the previous administrations in that realm. And so, you know, the propaganda around this is that Google is coming to invest in El Salvador, and that's going to be attractive to other companies, and that there's going to be more jobs. You know, but this is Salvadoran taxpayer money entering into a contract with a US corporation, and a lot of applause coming from the US Embassy about it. And the contract was entered in secret. So the details of the contract, like a lot of things under the Bukele administration, are under reserve. That's also another characteristic of authoritarian governments. So I don't know if that's helpful, and I don't know if anyone else had any other thoughts about that.
I could just briefly add something. So the embassy, before we met with them, had released a statement in response to Bukele's victory. And one of the things that they emphasized at the end of that statement was something called the root causes strategy. Has anyone heard of this root causes strategy? So the idea is that to address migration from Central America to the US is going to invest in economic opportunity and education and responses to gang violence in Central America. And so part of at least the outward facing policy of the US State Department is to encourage solutions to gang violence and economic destitution that is experienced in El Salvador. And theoretically, Bukele's crackdown on gang violence could be part of that strategy, right? There are questions of how committed the US is to that strategy, but even if you take them at face value, Bukele has not stemmed the tide of migration out of El Salvador during his time in power. And in fact, over 300,000 people have left the country since he took power in 2019. And that's been an issue going well back before the Civil War, as Professor Roberts laid out. The military dictatorship and repression leading to the Civil War was a cause of massive migration, especially to the US. That hasn't stopped since then, and it hasn't stopped under Bukele, even though he claims the state of exception has solved gang violence. So the US at least claims that their interest is, we don't want all of this migration. We know migration has become this big boogeyman in the presidential elections this year, used by right-wing politicians like Trump to stoke fears. And Bukele has played into that, of saying, I'm going to stop these causes of migration, and the US lends its official support. But there are certainly questions to the extent that the US or Bukele are committed to actually improving conditions. Economic conditions have not improved since Bukele took over. And certainly the causes of migration haven't ended.
I can also just quickly point out, my colleague here in the government department, Gustavo Flores Macias, who is really a specialist on Mexican politics, but he's long worked on the drug wars and violence and the militarization of policing in Mexico. He's a very staunch critic of it. He just had an article in Foreign Affairs, which is very influential, very much an establishment publication coming out of Washington. But it's very critical. It's basically on Bukele's drug wars in El Salvador, and he's very critical of what Bukele is doing. And Gustavo, traces out. He looks at some of the local level experiments in democratic policing and democratic responses to drug violence in Mexico and other places, and how they can be effective. And he talks about some of the limitations of the kinds of militarization strategies that, the mano dura that we were talking about before, and how it tends not to be effective over the long term. What's interesting is Bukele has now responded on Twitter. There's apparently a whole series of exchanges with Bukele going after our colleague, Gustavo Flores Macias. So it'd be interesting to look up, and I haven't seen Gustavo. Apparently Gustavo maybe has responded. But Bukele actually read this article and was very unhappy about it. He said about it by our professor at Cornell. So look it up. It's interesting.
I think that'll be all for today's panelists and for today's event. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
We will post this video on the CUSLAR website. That's CUSLAR.org. We meet tomorrow, Thursdays, at Annabelle Taylor Hall, 3rd floor. We write a newsletter. We discuss this, or I think we maybe discuss what's going on in Ecuador right now. Because, that was the big news of past 2 weeks, So more to look forward to, and thank you all for coming.
Are you all taking attendance so that we can email materials to folks?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Sonia.
Bye.
If it's all right with you guys, we're gonna take a quick photo. It's a group photo. Sorry, I'm like the grandma of the organization.
All teams now.
Thank you. All right. 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2. Thank you guys. Thank you guys so much. We still have 3 proposals left. How about it?
That was a long.
Thank you.
Wait.
I've been and it took so long.
Yeah, that is not like absolutely.
Well, sorry, I didn't take a lot of calls.
I guess.
Why? You know, also, I like.
But yeah, maybe like. Yeah, because then we're gonna scan it and then. Okay, so. It's it's called where so. And we like that, and I'm like, yeah.
So.
And she sent me a link. And then
Everyone's conducted. One of in December. So now we have to universities and so lots of stuff going around in. Yeah.
Wanted from tried to figure it out. Spell the correct name, that's what I thought. Yeah, I talked to him about.
You wanna join us on Saturday? I don't know. Oh, I guess they're. Sweet or red, that makes sense.
Go ahead.
This depends on this.
Okay.
Get a little bit bad and.
You guys.
Thanks.
I got it. Thank you so much. Thank you for putting this on the radio. Thanks for
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's take about your good work.
Oh, you too. I'll check out that article.
Of course. I just need a blister and.
Yeah.
Nice, you don't like trouble with training, so.
Pretty good. Yeah.
I'm just doing it, you know,
I'm like,
seeing
you
it.
know.
Wait. We have some, right now, what do we get? Taking up.
That one is like.
Oh, you don't know. Yeah. Yeah, so. Either.
Oh, and the recording.